The first thing I saw was the U-Haul. It was parked sideways across the gravel drive like it owned the place, which I suppose was exactly the point. The back was open, and there were boxes stacked along the porch railing, my porch railing, the one Phil and I had rebuilt from scratch last October, sanding it down in the cold until our fingers went numb. I sat in my car at the edge of the property for a long moment. The engine was still running. My coffee was still warm in the cup holder. Maybe you have the wrong cabin. Some small, stupid part of my brain suggested. I didn't have the wrong cabin. I could hear a child's voice somewhere inside. Then another. Then my son's laugh. That easy, unbothered laugh he's had since he was 17 and figured out that other people usually clean up his messes for him. I turned off the engine. You need to understand something about this cabin before I tell you the rest. Because if you don't understand what it meant to me, none of what comes next will make sense. Dennis and I bought it in the summer of 1998 for $62,000. It was a wreck. No insulation worth mentioning, a bathroom that smelled like rust, a kitchen so dark you needed a flashlight to find the refrigerator handle. We drove up from Burlington on a Thursday, walked through it in 20 minutes, and bought it anyway. We were like that together. We saw what things could be, instead of what they were. We were going to fix it up slowly, over the years, room by room. We were going to retire there. We had a whole plan. Then Dennis got sick, and plans have a way of not surviving that. He died on a Tuesday in February, 18 months before the morning I'm telling you about. Colon cancer. 9 months from diagnosis to the end. I held his hand and I told him I loved him, and I watched the best person I'd ever known disappear from a hospital bed in Burlington while sleet hit the window. After that, I sold our house. Garrett said it made sense. Too much maintenance, too many memories, too much upkeep for a woman living alone. I told myself he was looking out for me. I moved into a small apartment on Williston Road. I put the sale money in my account, and I tried to figure out how to still be a person without the one person who made me feel like one. The cabin is how I figured it out. Every Thursday morning, I drove north on I-89 with a thermos of coffee and a list. Phil Arsenault, the contractor, a quiet man from Johnson who chewed the same brand of spearmint gum for 30 years and never overcharged me a single time, met me there. We gutted the kitchen first, then the bathroom. We pulled up 40 years of water-damaged linoleum and found wide plank pine underneath. Nearly perfect. We refinished it over 3 weekends in the fall. I tiled the kitchen backsplash myself, on my knees, over 4 consecutive Saturdays. My back hasn't forgiven me. I don't care. I didn't tell anyone. Not Garrett, not my friend Ruth, not my sister in Connecticut. I wanted one thing in my life that was only mine, that was still becoming something, that hadn't already ended. $78,000, and 11 months later, the cabin was the most beautiful place I'd ever been. I told Garrett about it, or I was about to. I was planning to drive up with him in May, watch his face when he opened the door. I'd been imagining that moment for months. Then in March, he called. His voice had that particular warmth it gets when he needs something. I know that voice. I've known it since he was 8 years old and wanted to skip his piano lesson. Hey, Mom. So, Tessa and I have been thinking. Their landlord in Williston was selling the property. The timing was terrible. The kids were mid-semester at their school. They just needed somewhere to land for a few weeks, maybe through the summer. Could they possibly use the cabin? Just temporarily? He hadn't even asked if I was planning to use it myself. I told him I'd think about it. I said I needed to check a few things first. Of course, no rush, he said. Which meant, there is absolutely a rush, and I'm hoping you don't notice. I tried calling him back the next morning. Voicemail. That evening. Voicemail. The morning after that, Tessa texted me. Garrett mentioned you're totally open to it. We are so relieved. You are literally the best, Marlene. I stared at that message for a long time. I hadn't said yes. I hadn't said anything at all. Here's where I want to pause for just a second, because if you're watching from home right now and you've ever had someone assume your silence was permission, you already know exactly how my stomach felt reading that text. If stories like this speak to you, I'd love for you to subscribe. We're just getting started, and trust me, this gets so much worse before it gets better. I drove up on a Thursday, force of habit, the U-Haul, the boxes on my porch, Garrett's Subaru. And when I walked through the door I had stripped and refinished and rehung on new hardware, I found Tessa standing in my bedroom, with a measuring tape stretched between her hands. She looked up without a flicker of embarrassment. "We thought you wouldn't mind," she said. "The kids need the bigger room." I looked past her at the window I'd replaced, at the light fixture I'd chosen from a salvage shop in Morrisville, at the closet she was measuring. I said their names. I asked them to leave. And Garrett, my son, my only child, the boy I raised, looked at me with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite guilt. "Something worse than either, Mom," he said quietly. "You live alone. You have an apartment. This cabin is just sitting here." I drove back to Burlington in silence. I sat in my parking lot for 40 minutes watching the sun go down behind the Hannaford grocery sign. I had my phone in my hand. I'd already dialed the locksmith, but I didn't press send. Something had shifted in me in that bedroom, something cold and very quiet, and I was beginning to understand that changing the locks was not the most powerful thing I could do. It wasn't even close. What I didn't know yet was that in 3 days, I'd be going through Dennis's old filing cabinet looking for a utility bill, and I would find something tucked inside a manila envelope that would rewrite everything I thought I understood about the last year of my husband's life, and about exactly who Tessa really was. I want to tell you that I went home and slept. I didn't. I sat at my kitchen table on Williston Road until almost 2 in the morning, with a cup of tea that went cold, staring at the wall where I used to hang the calendar Dennis bought me every Christmas. Always a different national park, always with some corny note written on our anniversary square. I hadn't hung a calendar in 18 months. The wall was just a wall. You should have pressed send, I kept thinking. You should have called the locksmith. Why didn't you call the locksmith? But underneath that thought was another one, quieter and steadier, like something heard through a closed door, because changing the locks is what they'd expect you to do. And then they'd call it an overreaction. And then Garrett would look at you with that face, and you'd spend the next 6 months apologizing at Christmas dinner. I knew my son. I knew how this went. I poured the cold tea down the sink and went to bed. I didn't sleep, but I went to bed. The filing cabinet had been in the corner of my bedroom closet since the move. Dennis's. Dark green metal. 2 drawers. The kind of thing you'd find in an office liquidation sale from 1987, which is exactly where he found it. He loved a bargain that weighed 40 pounds. I'd been avoiding it. Not consciously. I told myself I was just busy, just settling in, just waiting until I had an afternoon to go through it properly. But the truth is that every time I opened that closet and saw it sitting there, something in my chest went tight, and I found something else to do instead. 3 days after I came home from the cabin, I opened it. I was looking for a utility account number, something mundane. I needed the reference number for an old Green Mountain Power account that apparently was still technically in Dennis's name, and the electric company had sent a letter, and I needed to sort it out. First drawer, tax records, car titles, the deed to the Burlington house, already transferred, already signed over during the sale. Insurance documents. A folder labeled medical in Dennis's blocky handwriting that I closed immediately and put back. Second drawer. Older files, bank statements from 2009. A folder of receipts from a bathroom renovation we did in 2014. Warranty cards for appliances we no longer owned. And in the very back, pushed flat against the rear panel, a manila envelope with no label. It's probably nothing, I thought. Old cards. Photos. It wasn't photos. Inside, there were 2 documents clipped together. The first was a letter, handwritten, on Dennis's yellow legal pad paper, dated 8 months before he died. I recognized the handwriting immediately, though it was shakier than I was used to, looser, the way his writing had gotten after the second round of treatment, when his hands weren't always fully his own. It was addressed to no one in particular. It read more like notes to himself than anything official. He wrote that he'd been thinking about the cabin, that he'd always imagined Garrett there someday, that he wondered sometimes if it made sense to, and here the writing got harder to read, to deed it forward eventually, so there's no question later. My heart was hammering, but I kept reading. The letter trailed off. There was no conclusion, no signature. It read like a man talking himself through something and deciding to sleep on it. Then I looked at the second document. It was a beneficiary amendment form. One of the supplementary forms from Dennis's life insurance policy, the kind you file to redirect a portion of the benefit amount. This one would have redirected $85,000 from the estate payout, away from me as primary, to Garrett directly, bypassing the joint estate entirely. Dennis's signature was at the bottom. Dated 6 weeks before he died. I sat with that for a moment. My husband had signed a form to redirect $85,000 without telling me. Okay, I thought. Okay. People make decisions when they're sick. People worry about their children. This is painful, but it isn't. Then I looked at the form more carefully. The handwriting in the filled fields, the beneficiary information, the account numbers, the reason code, wasn't Dennis's. I know my husband's handwriting. I had 31 years of grocery lists and birthday cards and reminder notes stuck to the coffee maker. The signature was his. Everything else had been filled in by someone else. Someone with small, neat, looping letters who pressed hard with the pen. I had seen that handwriting 3 days ago on a text message. You are literally the best, Marlene. I don't know how long I sat on the floor of my closet, long enough for my left foot to fall asleep, long enough for the afternoon light to shift from gold to gray. She filled out the form. She brought it to him when he was sick, and she filled it out and he signed it. And then, for whatever reason, in whatever quiet moment of clarity, Dennis had not filed it. The original beneficiary designation, naming me, was still on record with the insurance company. I'd received the full payout without ever knowing this form existed. Had he changed his mind about Tessa? Had he simply forgotten? Had he been too exhausted to follow through? I would never know. That was the thing that sat in the center of my chest like a stone. I would never be able to ask him. What I did know. This document was real. This document was evidence of something. And Tessa had been in my cabin for 72 hours measuring my closets while this piece of paper sat 40 minutes away in a filing cabinet she didn't know existed. I wonder if she ever thought about it, I thought. I wonder if she forgot, or if she assumes it was filed, or if she's been waiting for it to surface. I put both documents back in the envelope. I put the envelope in my tote bag. Then I called my friend Ruth. Ruth Calloway has been my closest friend since we taught at Burlington High School together in the 90s. She retired 3 years before I did and spent her post-teaching years doing bookkeeping and paralegal work for a small firm in Montpelier, mostly because, as she puts it, she cannot stand being bored and she likes knowing things other people don't. I drove to Montpelier that evening. I didn't tell her what I had. I just said I needed to talk. She took one look at my face when I walked in and poured 2 glasses of wine before I'd even sat down. I told her everything. The cabin, the measuring tape, what Garrett said, what I found in the filing cabinet. She didn't interrupt. Ruth never interrupts. It's one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who owns the cabin, Marlene?" "I do." "Is that documented?" "The deed is in my name. Only mine. Dennis never added it to the joint." "Good." She picked up her wine. "And this form, you said it was never filed." "As far as I know." "Then, it's not legally significant to the estate, but it's personally significant." She looked at me steadily. "The question is, what you want to do with it. I want to understand what I'm actually dealing with first." Ruth nodded slowly. "I know an attorney in Burlington. Property law, some family estate work. Her name is Diane Cho. She's meticulous, and she doesn't like bullies." She paused. "I think you two will get along." I drove home with the envelope on my passenger seat. I didn't play the radio. I wonder if Tessa thinks she's already won, I thought. I wonder how long she's been planning this. I found out, sooner than I expected, that the answer to that second question was, much longer than I knew. I didn't learn it from the attorney. I didn't learn it from any document. I learned it 10 days later, from a chance conversation at a coffee shop on Church Street in Burlington, with a man named Kevin Braddock, who went to UVM with Garrett in 2006, and who mentioned casually, while we were both waiting for our orders, that he'd heard Garrett and Tessa were going through a rough patch financially. "Yeah, I felt bad," Kevin said. "Heard the landlord situation was pretty rough. Eviction's never easy." I kept my face very still. "Eviction," I repeated. Kevin looked momentarily uncertain. "Oh, I mean, I don't know all the details. I just heard." "No, it's fine," I said. "I appreciate you telling me." Garrett had told me the landlord was selling, that the timing was unfortunate, that they simply needed somewhere to land. They had been evicted for non-payment. 3 months behind on rent. They hadn't been displaced by circumstance. They had been looking for a lifeline, and they had decided, without asking, that mine was available for the taking. I sat with Diane Cho 4 days later in her office on Pearl Street, 2 blocks from Lake Champlain. She was methodical and unhurried, and when I showed her Phil's invoices, every receipt, every dated photograph, $78,000 of documented improvement to a property solely in my name, she set them down and folded her hands. "They have no legal claim," she said. "None. They entered without written permission from the sole owner. Vermont's adverse possession timeline doesn't come close to applying. You could have them removed." "I know," I said, "but I don't want to just remove them." She studied me for a moment. "What do you want?" I thought about the measuring tape, about the cereal boxes in my new cabinets, about Garrett's voice saying you live alone, you don't need this, about Tessa's handwriting on a form she filled out in my dying husband's hospital room. "I want it to be permanent," I said. "I want there to be no version of the future where this can happen again, and I want them to understand exactly how it happened." Diane Cho looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen. "Tell me," she said, "have you ever heard of a revocable living trust?" I left her office an hour later with a yellow legal pad full of notes and something I hadn't felt in 18 months sitting quietly in my chest. Not anger, not grief, something colder than both, something that required patience. I was in the parking garage, keys in hand, when my phone buzzed. A text from Tessa. "Hi, Marlene. Garrett mentioned you've been thinking things over. We're so excited to make this official. I actually had our attorney draft something up so we're all protected. Sending it over now. You're going to love it." I stared at the screen. She has an attorney. She's already had an attorney draft an agreement. How long has she been planning this? I opened the attached document right there in the parking garage, leaning against my car in the fluorescent light. And as I read it, as I understood what she was actually trying to do, I felt something shift in the architecture of everything. Because Tessa had just made the single worst legal mistake of her entire plan. And she had no idea. I read the document twice in that parking garage. Then I read it a third time, slowly, the way you reread something, when you're certain you must be misunderstanding it because no one could possibly be this confident. But no, it was exactly what it appeared to be. Tessa's attorney, someone named Jeffrey Marsh, with a Shelburne Road address, and what I would later learn was a practice built almost entirely on residential closings and the occasional speeding ticket, had drafted a family occupancy and equity participation agreement. 6 pages, official letterhead, the kind of document designed to look more binding than it was. The language proposed that Garrett and Tessa be granted occupancy of the cabin for a minimum of 3 years, with language about contributing to property upkeep in lieu of market rate rent, and something called good faith equity participation discussions to commence no later than 18 months from execution. Equity participation, in my cabin, that they had moved into without asking. But here was the thing that made my hand tighten around my phone in that cold parking garage. In order to establish Tessa and Garrett's request for formal occupancy rights, Jeffrey Marsh had been forced to acknowledge, in his own legal language, on his own letterhead, that the property was owned solely by me. He'd written it plainly in the second paragraph, Marlene D. Cross, hereafter owner, holds sole title to the property located at, and then my cabin's address. She had handed me a document that confirmed I owned the property, confirmed they had no current legal standing, and asked me to sign away 3 years of occupancy without a single dollar of rent. She thought this was the offer I'd been waiting for. I forwarded it to Diane Cho with one line. "Is this what I think it is?" Diane replied in 4 minutes, "Yes. Don't sign anything. Call me tomorrow morning." I drove home doing 5 under the speed limit the whole way. I needed to think slowly. Diane was already at her desk when I called at 8 the next morning. "That document," she said, without preamble, "is a gift." She explained it the way she explained everything, methodically, without drama. By having her attorney put in writing that I was the sole owner, Tessa had eliminated any future argument about confusion or good faith belief in shared ownership. If this ever went before a judge, that letter would establish that Tessa knew exactly whose property she was occupying. "It also tells us something else," Diane said. She's been planning this long enough to hire an attorney. This wasn't spontaneous. The eviction, the move, the agreement, this had a timeline. I thought about Kevin Braddock in the coffee shop. Eviction's never easy. How long do you need? I asked. For the trust? 2 weeks to draft it properly. Another week to file and record. But Marlene? She paused. I want to time this carefully. I don't want to spook them before everything is in place. What do I do in the meantime? A beat of silence. You reply to Tessa, she said. You tell her you're reviewing it with your attorney and that you're very excited to get everything official. I almost smiled. That's it? That's it. Let her think you're moving towards signing. The more comfortable she gets, the less she's watching. I hung up and opened my texts. Found Tessa's message with the little house emoji still sitting there. I typed, got it? Reviewing with my attorney. So glad we're doing this the right way. More soon. I added a smiley face. It cost me something, that smiley face. But I sent it. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. Outwardly, nothing changed. I went to my apartment, I made my tea, I took my walks along the bike path by the lake where the ice was finally breaking up along the edges. Internally, I was running calculations constantly. Legal, financial, emotional. I also, quietly, drove past the cabin twice. Not to stop, just to look. The basketball hoop Garrett had put up was already listing to one side. The ground up there was still half frozen, and he hadn't set the base properly. Tessa's copper wind chimes, garish and loud, hung from the corner of my rebuilt porch. Someone had put a welcome mat at the front door. A welcome mat. At my front door. Let it go, I told myself, both times. You'll have time to be angry later. Right now you need to be patient. I was getting good at patient. Phil Arsenault called me on a Wednesday evening. He'd heard through someone in town that the cabin had new occupants. None of my business, he said, in his careful way. Just wanted to make sure everything's okay. Phil, I said, I have a question for you. Those records you keep, the photos, the invoices, the texts, you still have all of that? Everything. No hesitation. Every receipt, every dated photo, every message. I scan them all. My wife makes me. Could you put together a folder for me? Organized by date? A pause. Already done, he said. I put it together last week, when I heard. Figured you might need it. I had to take a breath before I could answer him. Thank you, Phil. You know, he said, almost as an afterthought, that Tessa came by the property about 2 weeks ago. Walked the perimeter. Asked me some questions about the renovation costs when I happened to be driving past. I went still. What kind of questions? What the work was worth, whether permits had been pulled, whether improvements like that typically added to assessed value. He paused. I told her she'd have to talk to the town assessor. I didn't like the questions. She was calculating the equity. Before the agreement was even signed, she was already thinking about what the renovation had added to the value of a property she intended to claim a stake in. Phil, I said, would you be willing to sign an affidavit, just confirming the work, the timeline, who contracted you? Already talked to my cousin about it, he said. He's a notary in Johnson. Just say when. Garrett called that Friday. Warm, easy, unbothered, the way he gets when he thinks things are going his way. Hey Mom, Tessa mentioned you're working through the agreement with your attorney. Just wanted to say, no pressure. We know this is a big step, and we just really appreciate your flexibility. Flexibility. Of course, I said. I just want to make sure everything is done properly. For your protection as much as mine. Exactly. Yeah, totally. I could hear him relaxing through the phone. The kids are loving Stowe Elementary, by the way. Nate made the spring soccer team. That's wonderful. And honestly, Mom, I think this could be really good for all of us. Having somewhere that's like a family anchor, you know? Dad would have wanted that. The line went quiet for a moment. Mine and his both. Don't, I thought. Don't use him. I think about what Dad would have wanted a lot lately, I said, very carefully. I've actually been going through some of his old files. Just organizing things. A brief pause. Oh yeah? Mm-hmm. You'd be surprised what you find. Another pause. Slightly longer. Well, Garrett said, let me know if you need help with anything. I will, sweetheart. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. He doesn't know, I thought. He genuinely doesn't know about the form. Tessa never told him. That was the most complicated thing I'd learned yet, because it meant what was coming wasn't going to feel the same for both of them. Diane called on a Thursday, 11 days after our parking garage conversation. The trust is drafted. I want you to read every line before we file. I drove to her office that afternoon. The trust document was 14 pages. I read every word, the way she asked. The language was careful and specific. The Marlene D. Cross Revocable Living Trust. The cabin transferred into it fully. And one particular clause, tucked into the occupancy provisions on page 9, which Diane had underlined in pencil. The property may not be occupied by any party other than the grantor, without written annual consent, renewable each January 1st, revocable by the grantor at any time and for any reason, with 30 days written notice to vacate. 30 days written notice. My choice. My timing. Every year. Once this is filed and recorded with Lamoille County, Diane said, any occupancy agreement they try to execute with you personally becomes legally complicated. Because you won't be signing as an individual property owner anymore. The trust owns the property. And the trust has these terms built in. I looked up from the document. So if they've already drafted an agreement expecting me to sign as an individual owner, their agreement becomes largely meaningless. Yes. I thought about Jeffrey Marsh and his 6 pages of official letterhead. File it, I said. While the trust was being filed, I did something I hadn't planned. I called Tessa and invited her to lunch. Just us. No Garrett. A Thursday, at the bistro on Stowe's Main Street. The kind of place with good soup and small tables and enough ambient noise that a conversation stays private. She arrived looking confident. She was wearing a new coat, and she'd just had her hair done, and she ordered a glass of wine at noon, which told me she considered this a celebration. I let her talk for the first 20 minutes. She talked about the kids, about her vision for the cabin's garden come summer, about a pottery class she'd started in town. She talked about the equity agreement in a warm, inclusive way, like we were business partners embarking on something mutually exciting. I ordered dessert. I let her finish the wine. Then, when the table was quiet, I reached into my bag. I placed a single sheet of paper on the table between us. A photocopy. Not the original. The original was in a fireproof lockbox in my apartment closet. She looked down at it. Her face did something complicated. It lasted less than 2 seconds, and then it was gone, replaced by a careful blankness that told me everything I needed to know. Where did you find that? She said. It wasn't a question. Dennis's filing cabinet. She picked up her wine glass and found it empty. She set it back down. I was trying to make sure Garrett got what was fair, she said. The estate laws in Vermont are complicated, and I was worried that, you filled out the form, I said. And then you brought it to him when he was on his 3rd week of the 2nd round of treatment. Silence. He signed it, she said. He did, I agreed. And then he didn't file it. She looked at the photocopy for a moment. I watched her calculating. What I knew, what I could prove, what I intended to do. What are you going to do with it, she asked. I picked up my coffee cup. I took a sip. I set it back down. I haven't decided yet, I said pleasantly. That was a lie. I had decided. But she didn't need to know that yet. I paid for lunch. I told her it was lovely. I drove home through the mountains with the windows down and the May air coming in cold and clean. Maybe you've been in a moment like that, where you're holding something that could change everything, and you have to decide how to use it, and when. I don't know what you would have done in my place. The trust was filed and recorded on a Monday. On Wednesday, Diane sent the letter. Certified mail. Signature required. Addressed to Garrett Allen Cross and Tessa Marie Cross at my cabin's address. I was in my apartment when Diane texted to say it had been delivered. I made a cup of tea. I sat in the chair by the window. I thought about Dennis. I thought about the first time we drove up to that cabin in 1998, how he'd stood in the middle of the ruined kitchen and said, Marlene, I think this might be something. It is, I thought. It really is. My phone rang 40 minutes later. Garrett. I let it ring. The letter gave them 30 days to vacate. But what happened in those 30 days, what Tessa did, what Garrett finally learned, what came apart, and what got rebuilt, that was something none of us had planned for, including me. Garrett called 4 times that Wednesday afternoon. I let everyone go to voicemail, not out of cruelty. I needed to know which version of my son was going to show up when I finally answered, the one Tessa had coached. or the one I raised? Those are two different conversations, and they require two different versions of me. The fifth call came at 6:47 in the evening. I picked up. He wasn't angry. That surprised me. He was quiet, in the way people get when the ground has shifted under them, and they haven't decided yet whether to grab something or just let themselves fall. Mom? Hi, sweetheart. I'm holding a letter from an attorney. I know. A long pause. Outside my window, a couple was walking a dog along the sidewalk, the dog stopping every 3 feet to investigate something invisible and urgent. Did you set up a trust, he said, without telling us. I set up a trust, I said, with my attorney, for my property. Yes. Mom, Garrett. I kept my voice even. Who owns the cabin? Silence. I need you to say it, I said, not unkindly. I need to hear that you know. Another long pause. You do, he said quietly. That's right. I heard him exhale. Then, lower. I didn't know about the eviction. I mean, I knew we were behind, but Tessa handled all of that. She told me the landlord was selling. I swear to you, Mom, I didn't. I believe you, I said, and I did, partially. But I also knew that a man who doesn't ask questions about his own finances isn't innocent. He's just comfortable letting someone else carry the weight of the decisions. That kind of not knowing is its own choice. There's something else, I said. I need to tell you something about your father. The silence that followed was different. Denser. Okay, he said. I told him. Quietly. Without theater. The filing cabinet. The manila envelope. The beneficiary amendment form, with Dennis's signature and Tessa's handwriting. The $85,000 that would have bypassed me entirely. The fact that Dennis, for whatever reason, had not filed it. I heard Garrett breathing. Then I heard him stop breathing. Briefly, the way you do when something lands in your chest that you're not ready for. She filled it out, he said. Yes. And brought it to him when he was, yes. The word Tessa didn't come out of his mouth. I noticed that. He couldn't say her name right then. I understood. Why didn't Dad file it? He asked. I don't know, I said. I've thought about it every day since I found it. I don't think I'll ever know for certain. What I didn't say, what I would never say out loud to my son, was what I had come to believe in the quiet of my own heart. That Dennis had looked at that form in some clear moment between treatments, recognized whose handwriting was in those fields, and understood something about his daughter-in-law that he didn't know how to tell us. That putting that form back unsigned was the last protective thing he did for me before he lost the ability to do anything at all. Dennis was like that, quiet and deliberate. He rarely said the hard thing directly. He just stopped doing the harmful one. What are you going to do with the form? Garrett asked. I haven't decided yet, I said. It was the same thing I'd told Tessa at lunch. This time, it was true. Tessa's response to the eviction notice was not quiet. Within 48 hours, she had called me twice. I let both go, and on the third call, left a voicemail that started warm and ended somewhere considerably less so. She mentioned the kids' school enrollment. She mentioned disruption and instability. She used the word cruel once, quickly, and then walked it back in the same sentence, which meant she meant it. She called Aunt Carol. This I learned from Carol herself, who phoned me on a Friday morning with barely contained satisfaction. She called asking me to talk some sense into you, Carol said. What did you tell her? I told her I thought your attorney had made a great deal of sense already. A pause. Then I asked her how Dennis was doing in those last weeks. Just to see. Carol. She got off the phone very quickly. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or put my head in my hands. I did a little of both. Carol also told me something she'd been sitting on for 2 years. 3 weeks after Dennis's funeral, Tessa had called her asking whether Carol knew what Dennis had set aside for Garrett. Whether there were any accounts or assets that might not have gone through the main estate. 3 weeks after the funeral. Before I'd finished returning casserole dishes. I didn't know what to make of it at the time, Carol said. I do now. Tessa made one more move. The boldest one. She contacted a local blogger in the Stowe area, a woman who ran a community Facebook page, an occasional neighborhood newsletter, with a story about a grandmother evicting her grandchildren from a mountain cabin in the middle of the school year. The blogger, to her credit, did what any decent journalist does before publishing. She made calls. Diane Cho answered hers. Within 24 hours, the blogger had reviewed the trust documentation, the contractor records, and the Lamoille County property filing. She had also, apparently, spoken to someone at the town assessor's office who confirmed that no co-ownership of the property had ever been registered. She did not run the story. She did, however, send Tessa a brief email explaining why. Diane forwarded it to me without comment. I read it once. I didn't save it. I didn't need to. On the 14th day after the letter arrived, Garrett came to my apartment alone. No Tessa. No kids. He knocked, and I opened the door, and he stood in the hallway looking like a man who had not slept well in 2 weeks, which I suspected was accurate. I made him coffee. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd done homework in 3rd grade, where we'd eaten 100 Sunday dinners, where Dennis used to read the paper every morning while I graded papers beside him. Garrett wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the table for a long time before he spoke. I let it be too easy, he said. I waited. She handled everything. The finances, the lease, I just let her handle it because she wanted to, and I didn't want to deal with it. He looked up. That's not an excuse. I know that. I'm just trying to explain how someone ends up sitting at his mother's kitchen table, not knowing half of what his own life has been doing. I looked at my son. I saw the 8-year-old who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. I saw the 20-year-old who called from college crying after his first real heartbreak. I saw the 38-year-old who said you don't need a cabin, and had no idea how much that cost me. Your father and I bought that cabin 2 months after we found out I couldn't have more children after you, I said. Did you know that? He looked up. No, he said. We'd been trying for a while. When it became clear it wasn't going to happen, we needed somewhere to put all that hope. So we drove up to Stowe on a Thursday, and we bought a wreck in the mountains, and we said we'd fix it someday. I paused. I fixed it. After he died. It was the only way I knew how to survive the first year. Garrett's jaw moved. He didn't speak. I wasn't being secretive to hurt anyone, I said. I was just trying to still be a person. He put his face in his hands. Not dramatically, just a man holding the weight of his own face for a moment. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, muffled, through his palms. I'm so sorry. I let the silence sit for a little while. Let it mean something. Then I said, I know. The 30 days ended on a Tuesday. They moved out without a sheriff. Without drama. The U-Haul appeared again, and by 4 in the afternoon, it was gone. The basketball hoop went with them. The welcome mat, the copper wind chimes. I didn't go up that day. I gave it a week. What I did do, in those final days before the move-out, was something I hadn't told anyone about. Not Ruth, not Diane, not Carol. I set up 2 educational trusts, $12,000 each. Garrett's boys, Nate and little Owen, 7 and 9 years old, who hadn't measured anything, hadn't assumed anything, hadn't done a single thing except exist in a situation their parents created. I named Ruth as the trustee administrator. I gave her the paperwork on a Wednesday morning over coffee. She looked at the amounts. She looked at me. Marlene, she said. Don't, I said. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright. Okay, she said. 3 months later, through a process I won't pretend was easy or fast, Garrett and Tessa entered couples counseling. Garrett's condition for staying in the marriage. I don't know what happens inside that room, and it isn't mine to know. What I do know is that in late August, as part of a mediated family agreement, no lawsuit, no courtroom, no public record beyond what was necessary, Tessa signed a written acknowledgement. It stated that the beneficiary amendment form had been her idea, that Dennis had not initiated it, that she had presented it to him during a period when his medication affected his clarity of judgment. Her attorney sat across the table from Diane Cho when she signed it. Jeffrey Marsh, of the 6-page equity agreement. He did not look comfortable. I watched Tessa sign. She didn't look at me. When it was done, I thanked everyone for their time. I shook Diane's hand. I walked out into the August heat. I sat in my car for a moment. I thought about what to feel. Justice had a particular texture I hadn't anticipated. Not triumphant, not sweet. More like the feeling after a fever breaks. A return to a temperature that's simply normal. Simply yours. I put the acknowledgement in my bag. I drove north. September in Vermont does something to the light that I have never been able to fully describe. It turns gold, but not the gold of summer. thinner, more specific. Like the light knows it's temporary, and it's decided to be beautiful about it. I pulled up to the cabin on a Saturday morning with one bag and my art supplies and a thermos of coffee. Phil had come by the week before to make sure everything was in order. He left a note on the kitchen counter that said only, "Looks good." I opened every window. I stood in the kitchen I had tiled on my knees, and I made tea in my own kettle on my own stove. I walked through each room the way you walk through something you thought you'd lost. The reading room, the reclaimed floors, the bathroom with the hex tile I'd special ordered from a place in Burlington that had a 6-week wait and was worth every day of it. I sat on the porch in the late morning, with my sketchbook open on my lap. The mountains were beginning to turn at the very edges, first red, up high, where the maples catch the season before anything else. I called Ruth. "I'm here," I said. "How does it feel?" I looked at the tree line. I thought about Dennis standing in the ruined kitchen in 1998, saying I think this might be something. I thought about my hands in the cold October air sanding the porch rail. I thought about the filing cabinet, and the envelope, and the form with her handwriting and his signature, and all the quiet months in between. "It feels like mine," I said. Ruth didn't say anything for a moment. "Good," she finally said. "It always was. I still have the boys' drawings on my refrigerator. Nate made me one last Christmas. The cabin, the two of us out front, smoke coming from the chimney even though we don't have a fireplace. Because he's 7, an artistic license is his birthright. Garrett and I talk every week or so now. It's careful still. Rebuilt things are always careful at first. But it's real, I think. More real than it was before, maybe. Because neither of us is pretending anymore. I don't know what happens with Tessa. That's not mine to resolve. What I know is this. I spent 11 months rebuilding something I loved because I needed to believe that broken things could become whole. I didn't know, when I started, that I was also rebuilding myself. That the person who drove back down that mountain on a cold Thursday in March, the one who stopped before hitting send on the locksmith's number, was someone who had finally stopped being afraid of her own patience. Dennis would have found that funny. He was always the patient one. Turns out I had it in me all along. I would have told him. I think he knew. I keep coming back to one question, and I don't have a clean answer for it. I've thought about it on the porch in the mornings with my coffee, and I still don't know. If you had found that form, the one with her handwriting, would you have used it the way I did, or would you have let it stay buried? And does holding something like that make you the keeper of the truth, or just another person deciding what other people deserve to know? I'd really like to know what you think.